Chapter 37, Leviathan. But the engine's not warmed up yet, Alec cried. We could crack a piston in this cold. It'll work or it won't, Hiss shouted back at him. The ship's going up either way. The Leviathan's master engineer had a point. Below them, ballast sparkled in the sunlight as it spilled down from the forward tanks. The metal dock rose beneath Alec's feet like an ocean vessel lifted by a wave. Men were streaming back toward the airship across the snow, the howls and whistles of godless animals echoing like a jungle around them. The airship shifted again, ice snapping from the ground's ropes as they stretched and tightened. Mr. Hurst had darted about outside the pod, cutting the pulley lines they'd used to haul the engine parts up. In a few moments, all connections with the earth would be severed. But the engine wasn't fully oiled yet. Half the glow plugs were still untested, and Klopp had forbidden starting up before he personally inspected the pistons. Will it run? Alec asked Hoffman. Worth a try, sir. Just start it slowly. Alec turned to the controls. It was still strange seeing the Stormwalker's needles and gauges out of their usual place in the pilot's cabin, and the gears and pistons that belonged in the walker's belly splayed in the open air. When he primed the glow plug, sparks flew around his head. Slowly now, Hoffman said, putting his goggles on. Alec took hold of the single saunter. The other was over on the starboard engine with Klopp, and pushed it gently forward. Gears caught and turned faster and faster until the rumble of the engine set the whole pod shivering. He glanced over his shoulder to see the plunder guts of Stormwalkers spinning before his eyes, black smoke rising from the exhaust tubes. Wait for the order, Mr. Hurst called from above the roar. He pointed at the signal patch on the airship's membrane. It was made of cuttlefish skin, the master engineer had explained, connected by fabricated nerve tissues to receptors down on the bridge. When the ship's officers placed colored paper on the sensors, the signal patch could mimic the hue exactly like a camouflage creature in the wild. Brilliant red meant full speed ahead, purple meant half power, and blue meant quarter speed with other shades in between. But with these untried engines, Alec doubted that his notion of half speed would be the same as Klopp's. It might take days to get the balance right, and the Germans would be here in minutes. The ground ropes were flailing as riggers cut them loose, and Alec felt another lurch beneath his feet. The cold wind was tugging at the ship now, the great beast skidding sideways along the glacier. Quarter speed! Hurst yelled. The signal patch had turned dark yellow. Alec slowly pushed the foot pedal down. The propeller engaged. It spun lazily for a moment, and then gears meshed and caught, the blades disappearing into blur. Soon the propeller was drawing an icy wind across the uncovered pod. He ducked lower, pulling his coat tight. What would full speed feel like? Down a notch! Down a notch! Hurst cried. Alec looked at the signal patch, which had turned paler. He eased the saunter back a bit, careful not to stall the engine. Hear that? Hoffman said in the relative quiet. Klopp's engine. Alec listened hard and made out a distant roar. While his own engine idled, Klopp's was going strong, pushing them into a gradual lift. It's working, he cried, amazed that the Stormwalker's engines could move something so vast through the sky. But Why are we turning east? Hoffman asked. Isn't the frigate coming from that way? Alec translated the question for Mr. Hurst. It might be that the captain wants to build up speed down the valley. We're a bit heavy, thanks to your engines, and forward motion gives the ship lift. Hurst hooked a thumb over his shoulder. Or it might be that he spotted those blighters back there. Alec turned, peering through the blur of propeller blades. Behind them, a fleet of ships were rising over the mountains. Condors, predators, interceptors, and a giant albatross assault ship dangling gliders from the gondola. A vast aerial attack, timed to descend just as the Hercules and its scouts arrived from Austria. The master engineer leaned back on the struts, lazily resting a foot on the main joint. He slipped his goggles on and said, I hope these noisy contraptions of yours are ready. I hope so too. Alec adjusted his own goggles and turned back to the controls. The Leviathan's nose swung slowly eastward till finally the airship was aimed down the length of the valley. It says full throttle. The slight patch turned bright red. Alec didn't wait for Hurst's command. He pushed the Saunters forward hard. A sputter erupted for a moment in the tangle of gears and pistons, but then the engine roared back to life, the propeller spinning under a shimmer of sunlight. Check your bearings, Hurst yelled over the noise. Alec saw what the man meant. The airship was veering to starboard, his engine pushing hard, then clops. The black teeth of the mountainous loomed ahead. He pulled the Saunter back a bit, but a moment later the ship was swinging too far the other way. Klopp must have also seen the turn and pushed his own engine to compensate. Alec growled with frustration. It was like two men trying to pilot a walker, each with control of one leg. Mr. Hurst laughed and shouted, Don't worry, lad, the air beast has the idea now. Alec squinted against the icy headwind, stretched out beside him. The creature had come alive. Waves traveled down its length, like a field of grass rippling in the strong wind. What happened? They called Celia, like tiny oars stirring in the air. The beast will steady us, even if your clanker engines can't. Alex swallowed, unable to take his gaze from the undiluted surface of the air beast. Working on the engines, he tried to think of the airship as a vast machine. Now it had become a living creature again. Somehow the tiny cilia were guiding them down the valley. It was like riding a horse, Alex supposed. Alex supposed you could tell it were where to go, but it chose where its own footsteps fell. Hoffman nudged his shoulder. Say farewell to our happy home, young master. Alec looked to his left. The castle was shooting past beside them. Provisions for 10 years, and he'd spent all of 2 nights there. But it was much too close. The castle walls were almost level with the engine. Below Alec, the dangling drop lines were still dragging along the snow, and they were headed straight toward the frigates and its scouts. We're not climbing. Looks like we're carrying an extra half-ton or so. Hurst shouted, the boffins can't have been this wrong. Are you certain these engines aren't heavier than you told us? Impossible. Master Klopp knows the exact weight of every piece of the Stormwalker. Well, something's holding us down, Hurst yelled. Alex saw flickers of light before them, more ballast spilling from the forward tanks. Then something solid spun past below. God's wounds, Hoffman swore. That was a chair. What's going on? Alec yelled at Hurst. The master engineer watched another chair flutter to the ground. They've sounded a ballast alert. Everything we can spare. Over the side, he pointed ahead. And there's why. Alex squinted against the icy wind. The white haze was rising in the distance. Metal limbs flashed in the sunlight, churning up a cloud of snow. The Hercules was hurtling up the valley toward them. At the altitude, the Leviathan's bridge would crash straight into the gun deck. Alec's instinct was to pull back on the saunter, but the signal patch was still red, which meant to go faster. Losing speed meant losing lift, which would only make things worse. And turning about would take them into the guns of the pursuing Zeppelins. Hoffman gasped his arm, leaning in closer and muttering in fast German, "This may be the Wild Count's fault." "What do you mean?" Alec asked. He'd hardly seen Volger since their argument the day before. The Count had sorely agreed to the plan, but hadn't helped at all with the engines. He'd spent the day hiking to and fro from the wrecked Stormwalker, transferring the wireless set and spare parts to their new cabins in the Leviathan. "We are moving things to your cabin, sir. Twice he had me wrap up a gold bar in your clothes. And heavy they were, too." Alec closed his eyes. What had Volger been thinking? Every bar of gold weighed 20 kilograms. A dozen hidden bars would be like having 3 stowaways aboard. Take the controls," he cried.